The ship labored, groaning against the formidable gray swells of the Atlantic. Its metallic hull bore a heavy, silent cargo. Not hopeful immigrants or casual tourists, but women, prisoners of war. They gathered tightly on the deck, figures in drab, ill-fitting uniforms, their hair pulled back severely, their eyes sunken and vacant from exhaustion. They had sailed away from a vanquished homeland where the skeletal remains of buildings still smoked and where hunger prowled, gnawing like a wolf at every doorstep. Each woman carried the crushing burden of an indeterminate future. They anticipated scorn, perhaps outright cruelty, and most darkly envisioned the clanking of chains and the chilling vacuum of solitary confinement. Yet, as the American shoreline gradually asserted itself, New York Harbor, a breathtaking panorama of cranes rising like an industrial forest and a skyline that seemed to shimmer in the distance. They realized they were confronting not the expected scene of humiliation, but something far more bewildering. Initially, it was the auditory assault that jarred them. The persistent whine of taxis weaving below the piers, the booming horns of ships, and, most disturbingly, the unrestrained, casual laughter wafting up from the docks. This was laughter that didn't sound stifled behind clenched teeth. It was mirth expressed without the crippling fear of being overheard or denounced. Back in Germany, they had become accustomed to the necessary practice of whispering. Whispers about rationing, about the incessant bomb raids, about the pervasive threat of informers. Here, the very atmosphere felt louder, unburdened, and utterly unafraid. When the gangway finally descended, the women stepped onto the solid ground cautiously, tightly clutching the few meager possessions they had left. American guards waited, but their demeanor was strikingly relaxed. Not the rigid, intimidating posture of conquerors brandishing rifles. Some smoked cigarettes with casual distraction, others shared jokes with the dockworkers. The German women braced themselves for the inevitable volley of insults, the physical shove that would force them into disciplined ranks. Instead, they witnessed a sight that shook them far deeper than any overt hostility might have. American women, exuding confidence and command, stood right at the edge of the pier, clipboards in hand. One of these women wore practical trousers rolled up at the cuffs, her sleeves pushed high as she curtly directed the men around her. Another held a formidable stack of documents, thicker than a Bible, and issued sharp, decisive orders that even the armed guards instantly obeyed. The German POWs froze in collective disbelief. In the world they knew, a uniform signified authority, and authority was the exclusive domain of men. But here, women acted with such self-possession, as if it were the most natural thing, instructing soldiers on prisoner movements, managing the flow of heavy crates and luggage, and sharply correcting male clerks who mishandled paperwork. A nurse, identifiable by her Red Cross armband, swept past them, distributing steaming cups of coffee. Her smile was neither pitying nor menacing, but simply one of brisk, focused professionalism. A German prisoner, herself a trained nurse who had served in a military hospital, watched the American woman and felt a surge of bitter realization. In Germany, she had been relegated to being little more than a silent shadow at the perimeter of the ward, her sole value residing in her unquestioning obedience. Observing her American counterpart move with such unquestionable certainty felt like a physical blow to her chest. The German women began whispering rapidly in hushed tones, questions pouring out faster than they could be answered. Could such conduct truly be permissible? Were these women genuinely allowed to speak so forthrightly? To issue commands, to stride alongside men without exhibiting deference or bowing their heads? The sight felt simultaneously improper and yet thrilling, akin to witnessing the violation of a social law so deeply entrenched that they had forgotten it existed. The entire busy harbor transformed into an impromptu stage for this new reality. Heavy trucks rumbled across the cobblestones, driven not exclusively by men, but also by women wearing caps and protective overalls. One girl, perhaps no older than 19, expertly maneuvered a vehicle piled high with cargo, her jaw set with determination, her grasp on the wheel assured. The German women watched, their minds flashing back to the wartime propaganda posters featuring idealized blonde housewives holding loaves of bread beneath the swastika. Those images had rigidly defined where their societal worth lay, but the dynamic scene unfolding before them narrated a completely different, revolutionary story. One young prisoner, barely 20 years old, gripped the ship's handrail until her knuckles whitened. She recalled her mother's silent tears when her older brother left for the front, and the neighbors' earnest reassurances that a woman's role was to endure sorrow, not to assume leadership. Observing the bustling dockyard, she experienced a complicated, nameless emotion. A mixture of undeniable envy, profound disbelief, and a yearning so abrupt and potent that it momentarily stole her breath. The guards swiftly herded the women into open trucks destined for an inland camp. The subsequent journey took them through American towns where storefront windows showcased an abundance far exceeding anything the German women had witnessed in years. Towering displays of canned goods, bright bolts of fabric, and shoes, polished and perfectly new. Yet, what captured their attention more powerfully than the consumer goods were the customers themselves. Women, both young and elderly, stood at the counters, confidently counting out dollars, making purchases with assured voices, unescorted by a husband or father. One POW murmured in awe, "They are free to buy what they wish." Another shook her head, still struggling with disbelief. Back home, ration cards had to be stamped under the severe, watchful eye of state officials. Every single loaf of bread required a negotiation. Here, the act of commerce appeared casual, unguarded, and women navigated this marketplace as unquestioned equals. The trucks rattled past a local schoolyard where children played, their laughter sharp, bright, and utterly carefree. Outside the wire fence stood mothers, some cradling infants, some engaged in easy conversation with neighbors. One woman pulled a notebook and pen from her purse and scribbled something down with an air of brisk, focused determination. A prisoner with a teaching background watched this scene in silent reverence. In their homeland, schools were primary instruments of state ideology. Every lesson was essentially a sermon dedicated to loyalty and conformity. Yet here, the women waiting at the fence spoke as though their opinions genuinely mattered, as though their voices inherently carried societal weight. The teacher wondered what it must feel like to speak so completely freely, without fear of political consequence. As the convoy penetrated deeper into the vast American landscape, the countryside unfolded like a carefully rendered painting. Fields lightly dusted with early frost, iconic red barns, and telephone wires stretched taut against the expansive sky. To the German women, the overwhelming sense of civic order was unsettling. Their own nation had been ravaged by war, reduced to smoldering rubble and stunned silence. Here, even the simple barns stood tall and defiant, completely unbroken. But once more, it was the inhabitants who delivered the greatest shock. They saw women operating heavy tractors, guiding plows across the fields, women in kerchiefs confidently hoisting bales of hay, their hands visibly calloused, their posture radiating fierce pride. At the destination, the stark reality of the barbed wire fences awaited, instantly reminding the women that they were prisoners, not welcomed guests. Yet, even within the confines of the camp, the active presence of American women proved impossible to overlook. Female guards efficiently checked the roll call. Red Cross volunteers managed the distribution of crucial supplies like blankets, and camp secretaries typed up official reports with clear authority. Every single encounter delivered a quiet, subversive message. In this country, women spoke, made decisions, and took the lead. At night, huddled on cots beneath the drafty barracks roof, the German POWs exchanged astonished whispers. Some quickly dismissed everything they had seen as mere American eccentricity or cultural chaos. Others muttered darkly that such excessive freedom was certain to breed societal disorder. But a significant number, staring intently into the darkness, felt the stirring of a dangerous, novel idea. a question they had never before allowed themselves to voice. What if women were meant to be more than just silent witnesses? What if this audacious public visibility was not a sign of national weakness, but a profound expression of strength? The true shock of their arrival lay not merely in the recognition of their nation's defeat, but in the sudden confrontation with a world whose gender hierarchy was fundamentally inverted. They had arrived expecting hard punishment, but instead, they were exposed to a type of freedom that disturbed and unsettled them far more deeply than any cruelty could have. The nightly clang of the camp gates reaffirmed their status as captives. Yet, just beyond those gates moved women who appeared freer than any German woman was ever permitted to be by a German man. As the days continued, this dissonance intensified. For the very first time, these women began to suspect that their captivity might inadvertently reveal a truth more potent than the steel of their chains. What they had witnessed at the harbor was not just a foreign nation. It was the embodiment of a different social possibility, one that would linger and haunt them long after the fences enclosed their physical bodies. Life inside the American camps quickly settled into a monotonous rhythm that felt profoundly alien. Each morning the German women were roused by the clang of bells and the faraway rumble of trucks operating outside the perimeter. They had anticipated brutality, but the regulations proved methodical, almost coldly bureaucratic. Set work details, scheduled meal times, predictable inspections. Nevertheless, what truly unsettled them was not the barbed wire or the demeanor of the guards, but the ceaseless, tantalizing glimpses of daily American life just beyond the fence line. The wire felt less like a barrier and more like a theater curtain, through which they observed a performance that openly defied every rigid lesson they had internalized about proper womanhood. In the homeland they had fled, nationalistic ideology had meticulously carved womanhood into an extremely narrow mold, summarized by the dictum Kinder, Kusch, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. Propaganda posters had relentlessly promised honor through unquestioning obedience and dignity through self-effacing silence. A good German woman was defined almost exclusively as a mother and a caretaker, with little room for ambition beyond that. Yet here in America, the demands of the global war had rewritten the lines of gender roles in ink so bold and indelible it was impossible to ignore. By 1944, 6 million American women were actively engaged in wartime industries, assembling airplanes, riveting steel beams, and proficiently filling the critical factory roles left vacant by men deployed to Europe. The German POWs saw their images in the occasional newspapers permitted into the camps. Women with their hair tightly bound in scarves, hands blackened with grease, their expressions radiating determined competence. To these prisoners, Rosie the Riveter was not a distant propaganda figure. She was a vibrant, ubiquitous reality. The sheer scale of this contrast began to gnaw at them, relentless as physical hunger. One prisoner, a 30-year-old who had once taken profound pride in her meticulous efficiency managing her family's meager bread rations in Stuttgart, gazed at a newspaper photograph showing women lined up along a Detroit assembly line. She murmured that in her entire life in Germany, she had never operated a machine more sophisticated than a simple sewing wheel. Another, younger woman confessed that she had always secretly envied her brothers, who were permitted to pursue education, while she was firmly channeled toward domestic service. Seeing American girls with textbooks tucked under their arms, strolling freely onto university campuses, felt like watching someone effortlessly smash through a restrictive wall she had never fully acknowledged existed. The modest camp library housed stacks of donated American magazines. Although heavily censored, these publications were filled with glossy images that struck the German women as a kind of reverse propaganda. There were advertisements featuring women smiling beside the cars they personally drove, wives confidently choosing which brand of refrigerator to buy, and cheerful young students emerging from university lecture halls. The POWs lingered over these pages, their fingers hesitantly tracing the photographs, as if attempting to verify their reality through touch. Some nervously laughed off the contents, insisting that America was merely decadent and that the images were nothing more than a shallow charade. But the insidious seed of doubt had already taken root. One afternoon, peering through the wire, the prisoners observed a local farm family delivering produce. The farmer's wife was the first to climb down from the wagon. She wore practical, knee-patch trousers and a kerchief, and she addressed the military guards directly, bargaining assertively over the weight of the potatoes and even correcting them on a quantity miscount. Her husband stood silently behind her, nodding in agreement whenever she emphatically made her point. The German women exchanged wide-eyed, stunned glances. In their cultural experience, the man would always speak, and the woman would silently nod her assent. Here, the dynamic appeared entirely inverted. A young prisoner muttered that if she had dared to speak over her father, she would have been instantly slapped into silence. Yet this American woman's voice carried authority, completely free of hesitation. Even the heavily censored letters sent back home contained scattered fragments of this continuous astonishment. One German nurse wrote that she had observed women in military uniforms marching alongside men without any hint of shame, acting as if they fundamentally belonged there. Another described hearing women in town laughing loudly. Not the demure, hushed sounds required of them at home, but robust, unafraid outbursts. These written testimonies, despite being meticulously sanitized by censors, managed to preserve the underlying sense of awe that permeated the camps. The German women were thus not merely viewing a foreign country. They were being shown a previously unimaginable possibility for their own lives. The historical irony was piercing and undeniable. In Germany, women were relentlessly glorified as the sacred bearers of the nation's future, yet were systematically stripped of all personal agency. They were constantly told they were sacred vessels while simultaneously being denied a voice. In America, women were not necessarily cloaked in such rhetoric, yet they were welding structural components for aircraft, earning independent paychecks, and studying jurisprudence. Trapped between these two radically opposed worlds, the German prisoners found the contradiction utterly impossible to ignore. Still, disbelief stubbornly persisted. A few insisted that this was a temporary wartime anomaly, certain that once the men returned, American women would be summarily relegated back to their kitchens. They laughed with bitter cynicism at the notion that work trousers and official clipboards could possibly endure the coming peace. Yet, even those who most vehemently scoffed felt a subtle, undeniable emotion stirring within them. One prisoner admitted almost inaudibly that she envied the American women, not primarily for their jobs or their material possessions, but for the simple fact that men genuinely listened when they spoke. This singular detail, more than any other, seemed to penetrate the ingrained German worldview like a sudden shaft of sunlight through a closed shutter. The cognitive conflict deepened particularly during meal times, overseen by brisk American women volunteers from the Red Cross. One prisoner distinctly recalled a young, energetic volunteer who insisted upon absolute fairness when a male guard tried to cut procedural corners. She argued her point calmly, yet with unyielding firmness, and the guard was forced to concede. The German women discussed this incident in hushed tones for days. Authority in this new reality, they observed, did not appear to be predicated on physical force or rigid hierarchy, but rather on self-assured confidence, and that confidence could demonstrably belong to a woman. Moments of humor did surface, though they were always sharply edged with latent envy. One German prisoner once attempted to mimic the clipped, decisive American accent after overhearing a camp secretary issue an instruction. Her companions dissolved into laughter at the mangled pronunciation, but underneath the amusement, a deep sense of longing persisted. They chose laughter because imitation felt safer than explicitly acknowledging desire. This stark mirror effect intensified as the weeks passed. Inside the fences, the German women were still subjected to strict discipline, their days rigidly structured, their roles meticulously confined. Outside, American women drove essential machinery, conducted classes, and publicly debated political issues. The prisoners were caught in the crushing friction between two distinct realities, one brutally enforced by the wire, the other tantalizingly glimpsed just beyond it. With every observation, the confining wire seemed to grow conceptually thinner. The personal realm began to merge with the ideological. The German women commenced a silent, profound wrestling match with the core tenets of their upbringing. If American society could confidently entrust women with complex machinery, financial power, and critical decision-making roles, then perhaps the restrictive rules they had lived under were not immutable laws of nature, but merely the arbitrary laws devised by men. This realization was simultaneously liberating and utterly terrifying. To accept it meant admitting the extent of their own prior subjugation, and once that admission was made, it was a truth that could never be erased. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the camp barracks, bruising the sky in shades of deep violet, a young prisoner leaned against the wire fence. She watched headlights tracing a slow path along a nearby road, and through the glass she clearly saw a woman at the wheel, her hair streaming back in the wind. The image instantly etched itself onto her memory. She whispered to her bunkmate that she would carry that sight forever, a woman steering her own course. The words hung suspended between them, fragile yet electrically charged, a yearning confession skillfully disguised as a neutral observation. The mirror reflecting these two worlds was proving to be more than a simple contrast of nations. It was a brutal confrontation of fundamental identity. These German women had been indoctrinated to believe that their silence represented virtue and their obedience defined strength. Yet in America, they were witnessing voices raised without apology and life choices made without requiring explicit permission. Every day spent in captivity uncovered not new chains, but profound contradictions, and each contradiction inexorably chipped away at the rigid certainties they had carried with them across the Atlantic. Although some prisoners clung fiercely and stubbornly to the old cultural doctrines, many others could no longer shake the gnawing suspicion that what they were witnessing was not a temporary wartime measure or a superficial eccentricity, but something profoundly deeper, a robust foundation upon which an entirely different kind of life could be constructed. It was a realization that felt both intoxicating and profoundly dangerous. For if women could confidently command trucks, manage clipboards, and oversee classrooms in America, what fate awaited these prisoners when they were repatriated to a defeated Germany where strict silence and subservience would surely be demanded of them once more? The unspoken question permeated the air like lingering smoke, and though nobody dared articulate it, its presence was palpable. The mirror reflected not just America, but terrifyingly, what they themselves might one day choose to become. The days in the camps settled into a uniform rhythm. However, within that structure, the German women found themselves receiving lessons they had never anticipated. Initially, they believed the novelty of the American women's authority would inevitably diminish, that their initial astonishment would mellow into weary indifference. Instead, the exact opposite happened. Every new encounter with American women intensified the feeling that they were sequestered inside a quiet, unintentional classroom of freedom. A place where the smallest gesture carried ideological weight far surpassing any official speech. Work details served as the primary arena for these revelations. Many POWs were dispatched to nearby farms to alleviate the pervasive labor shortage, encountering American wives who effectively managed entire agricultural households in the extended absence of their husbands. The reality was utterly disarming. A 35-year-old German widow recalled standing in the chilled fields, holding a hoe, while the farm's mistress directed both the prisoners and the hired men in a tone that required no apology. She did not hesitate to correct a military guard regarding the measured weight of the harvested grain. She dismissed unsatisfactory excuses with a mere flick of her wrist, and when a vital tractor sputtered to a halt, she climbed onto the heavy machinery herself and performed the repairs with practiced, efficient ease. The prisoners watched her oil-stained hands and grasped the profound truth. This woman was no rare exception. In this place, she was clearly the norm. Inside the camp confines, Red Cross volunteers regularly arrived, bringing boxes filled with necessities. Blankets, soap, and even reading material. One young American woman, her spectacles resting neatly on her nose, addressed the prisoners not as defeated inferiors but with the brisk, orderly courtesy of a librarian curating her collection. She handed out novels, many authored by women, and her oversight of the distribution process went completely unchallenged. The German POWs later whispered that she carried herself with the assured presence of a school teacher. Yet they knew that in Germany, a school teacher still habitually deferred to male inspectors. This American woman deferred to absolutely no one. The subtle but powerful lessons continued to accumulate. A secretary in the administrative office, her typewriter keys clattering with machine gun speed, dared to interrupt a commanding officer mid-sentence when he mistakenly cited a figure. She didn't flinch beneath his disapproving frown, but calmly repeated the corrected number until he reluctantly conceded the point. In the infirmary, a nurse sharply scolded a soldier for his negligence, and he accepted her stern rebuke without showing offense or anger. Even a guard's wife, visiting with a prepared basket of food, spoke candidly in front of her husband, engaging him in a lively debate about politics while he listened passively. To the German women, every single one of these moments felt like a minor geological event, a seismic shattering of assumptions they had long believed were permanent and immovable. Conversations among the prisoners increasingly became quiet confessions of both doubt and raw envy. One woman recounted her mother's oft-repeated dictum, "A woman's greatest strength is patience." Yet here, strength visibly meant something utterly different: action, decisive choice, and having an audible voice. Another admitted she had once devoutly prayed that her daughters would grow up to be compliant, obedient wives. Now, she openly questioned whether obedience was a virtue worth seeking in the first place. The barracks roof buzzed nightly with whispered reflections, the women diligently attempting to assemble the pieces of a complex, dangerous puzzle that had been deliberately concealed from them their entire lives. The American women, generally oblivious to the profound, silent revolutions they were inciting, simply carried on their duties without fanfare. They sometimes introduced music into the camp atmosphere, jazz records spinning, voices crooning in rich, smoky tones. A German nurse, while caring for an ailing bunkmate, listened to the sound of Ella Fitzgerald's voice wafting from a guard's radio, and felt that the music sounded like liberty itself, warm, brazen, and utterly unashamed. On another occasion, the POWs observed a town hall meeting from the back of a transport truck. Through the brightly lit windows, they heard women's voices arguing fiercely, not about domestic affairs, but about municipal issues like ration distribution and school budgets. Crucially, no man attempted to silence them. The German prisoners exchanged looks of collective shock. In their country, such public assertiveness from women would have been instantly denounced as hysterical or even subjected to swift punishment. Humor still surfaced, invariably tainted with longing. One prisoner theatrically attempted to imitate the deliberate, confident stride of an American woman she had seen on the street. Shoulders squared, chin elevated, steps brisk and completely unapologetic. Her comrades erupted in giggles at the performance, but the amusement swiftly faded into a strained silence, a silent admission that the behavior they mocked was precisely the freedom they secretly coveted. They laughed because it was the easiest way to avoid confessing their desire. Each passing day honed the internal conflict. They were still official prisoners, confined by wire and monitored by armed guards. Yet outside that perimeter, American women moved with an air of complete possession, as if the world were inherently theirs to command. The German women found the irony inescapable. In their physical captivity, they were being granted an unfiltered view of a freedom they had never once tasted in their own homes. The more they observed this life, the more difficult it became to dismiss it as a mere passing anomaly. Some committed their observations to diaries, scribbling notes between the mandatory censored lines. One entry declared, "They are not afraid to speak. Even when men contradict them, their voices are not silenced." Another confessed, "Perhaps our much-vaunted silence was never a sign of strength, but merely an act of profound surrender." These words, fragile yet defiantly written, signaled a personal transformation that could not be reversed. The powerful metaphor of the camp gates continued to haunt their minds. Each morning they swung open to allow the women to march to work details, and each evening they clanged shut once more. Yet beyond those gates existed the persistent, vivid images that infiltrated their dreams. A woman gripping a tractor's wheel, another counting dollar bills at a checkout counter, another standing confidently before a classroom of students. The physical barriers contained their bodies, but their burgeoning imaginations effortlessly slipped through the bars. As winter approached, even the most minor interactions carried immense weight. A prisoner thanked an American volunteer for a ration of soap, and the woman replied, "Everyone deserves dignity." The words were outwardly simple, but to the prisoner, they resonated like a thunderclap. She repeated the phrase later to her barracks companions, who listened in stunned silence, unable to disregard the radical possibility that dignity was not a privilege granted by men, but an inherent universal right. The most reserved women began to exhibit subtle shifts in behavior. A shy woman who habitually bowed her head during conversations started to maintain eye contact when speaking. A widow who had long accepted silence as her inevitable lot began to question official orders more directly, occasionally drawing reprimands, but losing her crippling fear of consequence. Each individual shift was minor, almost undetectable, yet cumulatively they formed an irresistible current propelling the women toward an unspoken, undeniable awakening. And yet, beneath the rising tide of admiration, a deep-seated fear persisted. They knew the war's end was approaching, and they would soon be returned to a Germany dominated by wreckage and rigidly enforced old expectations. What precisely would happen when they re-entered a society that unequivocally demanded their silence once more? Could they truly erase the memory of what they had witnessed, the raw authority embedded in an American woman's voice, the sheer liberty expressed in her stride? That existential question hovered over every conversation, a sharp, internal pressure pressing against their ribs like a hidden blade. The lessons they were absorbing in captivity were not merely external curiosities. They were ideological provocations. Every casual clipboard, every working tractor, every female voice raised in command became a stark reminder that the social boundaries delineated for them at birth were utterly negotiable, not divinely unbreakable. And though none of them dared to speak the full thought aloud without a visible tremor, the conviction strengthened daily. If American women could live this way, perhaps they, too, could seize that potential. It was a profoundly dangerous thought, more dangerous than the barbed wire or the looming guard towers, because it offered the unauthorized promise of a future their captors had certainly never intended for them. As the war inexorably approached its final conclusion, the women began to grasp that captivity itself was acting as a crucible for their transformation. They had arrived expecting retribution and punishment, but what they were receiving was a powerful, unforgettable education. And like any true education, it conferred a burden of knowledge that could never be unlearned. The air in the barracks at night grew heavy with this shared, unspoken tension. One woman whispered fiercely that when she eventually returned home, she would refuse to bow her head at the dinner table ever again. Another immediately warned her to be careful, arguing that a defeated Germany would never tolerate such defiance. But the first woman simply smiled in the darkness and stated, "Then let Germany change." The audacious words hung in the silence like electric sparks. They were merely whispered, but the images did not fade. Indeed, as the weeks turned into months, the German prisoners of war began to grasp a startling truth with increasing clarity. The most profound shock was not the fact of their capture by American forces, but the realization that America was, in fact, subtly liberating them in fundamental ways they had never conceived of. The lessons absorbed behind the barbed wire fences would inevitably accompany them back across the Atlantic, becoming a truth that would never allow them peace. With the cessation of hostilities, the detention camps gradually emptied. The German women, many of whom had resigned themselves to never seeing their homeland again, were now faced with the reality of repatriation. The very trucks that had delivered them into confinement now transported them back toward a continent deeply scarred and politically fractured. Preparing for the ocean voyage, many of them recognized a startling internal dissonance. They were not the same women who had departed. The physical barriers had restrained their bodies, but their intellects had journeyed far beyond the wire, and the emotional cargo they carried back was more subtle than physical wounds, yet infinitely more powerful and enduring. The transatlantic voyage was weighed down by recollection. They stood at the ship's railing, gazing blankly at the churning gray water. But their true focus was fixed on the American landscape. The dusty fields where local women skillfully operated heavy tractors, the sunlit classrooms where young girls confidently carried school books, the bustling town halls where mothers engaged in open political debate. These vivid scenes adhered to their consciousness like vital contraband concealed deep within their garments. One prisoner whispered to her neighbor that she dreaded the return more intensely than she had ever feared capture, for her imprisonment had unexpectedly provided her with glimpses of a self-determination that her own homeland seemed intent on denying. Another confessed she would prefer to remain permanently behind the American fences than to step back into a structured life where her opinions held no value. Their hushed words, uttered against the monotonous crash of the waves, sealed a silent, solemn pact to retain these memories. The moment they disembarked onto the ruins of Germany, the cultural and physical contrast was devastatingly immediate. Streets still gaped open, ravaged by massive bomb craters. Buildings stood as grim skeletons of shattered brick and twisted steel. Food was critically scarce, and hope was scarcer yet. Men, those who returned from the fronts broken or missing limbs, or those who simply failed to return at all, saw the old social hierarchies rapidly reassert themselves. The families of the returned women expected them to immediately revert to type, to bow their heads, to silently occupy the prescribed spaces of kitchens and laundry rooms, and to rebuild the shattered nation with dutiful patience, offering no word of complaint. But an immutable core within them resisted this expectation. They had witnessed an entirely different mode of existence, and the potent memory of it throbbed beneath every familial command for silence and obedience. One woman, known for her previous timidity, now argued openly with her father over the equitable division of dwindling food rations. Another, a trained nurse who had observed American counterparts confidently assume leadership roles in hospitals, flatly refused to defer to the village doctor when she recognized that his prescribed treatment was fundamentally flawed. A young widow who had dared to whisper in the camp barracks that subservience was not synonymous with strength, began relating stories to her children of American women who operated heavy machinery and managed their own finances. While her skeptical young sons often laughed, dismissing these accounts as pure fantasy, her daughter listened intently, her eyes reflecting a dangerous, nascent curiosity. In the heart of Germany, broken and under occupation, societal transformation began to unfold in ways both imperceptible and revolutionary. In 1949, West German women finally secured the right to vote. Amidst the nationwide destruction, women were working not merely as family caretakers, but actively as builders, using their bare hands to clear immense quantities of rubble from the streets, and patiently waiting in lines for industrial jobs once strictly reserved for male workers. The former PWs who had returned from America observed these rapid shifts with a profound and strange sense of recognition. For these women, the sight of others lifting heavy bricks or confidently signing electoral ballots was far from shocking. Rather, they were seeing familiar echoes of the independent lives they had witnessed across the Atlantic. They began to whisper among themselves that perhaps the revolutionary seeds planted during their captivity were, at long last, beginning to take root and bloom, even amidst these fields of ash. Yet the path forward was arduous. Families pushed back fiercely. Communities often mocked their new assertiveness. Old societal expectations held firm, clinging tightly to the women like oppressive ivy enveloping a ruined wall. Some women, exhausted by the struggle, reluctantly yielded to the pressure, dutifully burying their transformative memories beneath the demands of domesticity. But a resilient few simply could not forget. In their most private moments, They would silently repeat the powerful phrases they had internalized in America. Asterisk, everyone deserves dignity. Asterisk, they deliberately mimicked the confident strides of women they had seen walking boldly down American streets. They visualized the farm wives fearlessly negotiating market prices. They recalled the sharp, decisive sound of typewriter keys hammering official authority onto paper. These powerful recollections became their invisible armor against forced silence, even as the devastated world around them relentlessly insisted they return to immediate, unquestioning obedience. The cultural transformation was neither consistent nor instantaneous, but its presence was undeniable. A woman who previously would have laughed nervously at the sight of pants now purchased a pair and wore them while working to clear the city rubble. Another, inspired by the memory of American mothers addressing school boards, began forcefully lobbying her local council for improved rations for children. These acts, though minuscule and almost invisible against the overwhelming scale of the nation's destruction, were nonetheless vital acts of profound defiance. Every gesture, every voice raised in protest, every choice made without prior permission, represented a critical thread being pulled from the tightly woven fabric of the old, restrictive social order. The metaphor of seeds was carried organically across the vast continent. In the unlikely, fertile soil of American captivity, revolutionary ideas had been carefully planted. They were transported back home, not within packed suitcases, but securely held in memory, invisible yet absolutely impossible to extinguish. And much like seeds, they sprouted with deliberate slowness, pushing forcefully against the physical and societal rubble, fragile in appearance yet utterly insistent in their growth. Even decades later, as Germany reconstructed itself into a new, thriving nation, the women who had once stared in awe at the sight of American women commanding clipboards and driving tractors still recalled the initial, exhilarating shock of that observed freedom, finally understanding that they had been witnesses to a historical phenomenon far grander than the scope of a single world war. Not all of them chose to speak openly of their experiences. Some quietly buried their sense of astonishment, fearing public ridicule or disbelief. Others only shared the experience in fragments, relaying stories to their daughters disguised as entertaining curiosities. In America, women could drive motorcars entirely alone, or, asterisk, in America, women spoke to men without any need for deference or bowing. Asterisk, to the younger generation, these fragments often sounded like enchanting myths, but for the mothers, they were concrete proof of another possible world, smuggled back across the vast ocean like essential light. Historians, examining the large sweep of post-war change, would later describe these transformations as subtle and maddeningly difficult to trace. But the women themselves possessed a deeper certainty. They had felt the fundamental shift deep within their own bones. They had stood on the docks observing American women wielding clipboards and issuing commands to soldiers. They had watched headlights crawl along dark roads with women confidently seated at the wheel. They had heard female voices raised in robust laughter and passionate debate, entirely free of fear. These were not mere philosophical abstractions. They were visceral memories, deeply carved, and they could never be obliterated by the sheer weight of rubble or the enforcement of silence. Thus, the narrative of their captivity transcended a simple tale of barbed wire and towering guard posts. It unfolded as a profound paradox. In the very environment specifically engineered to render them powerless, the German women had encountered power in its most utterly unexpected form. Their physical chains of imprisonment had been demonstrably real. However, the far stronger constraints binding them were the restrictive social ideologies they had brought with them from home. America had not shattered those internal chains through aggression or violence, but through sheer visibility, through the presence of women who simply lived their lives as though fundamental equality were a natural, inevitable, and unquestionable right. Years afterward, some of those former PWs would confess that the true, deep humiliation was not the sting of military defeat, but the agonizing recognition, realizing they had been denied a basic dignity that had always fundamentally been theirs to claim. Yet that very recognition became the most potent form of liberation, for once a truth is seen, it cannot be unseen. Once a new possibility is believed, it can never truly be forgotten. As this complex history draws to a close, one might imagine a woman standing years later, perhaps decades older, again at a bustling harbor, watching large ships drift against the pale horizon. She remembers vividly the moment she first stepped onto American soil, bracing herself for expected punishment, only to be met instead by women who laughed freely, issued sharp commands, and lived without the burden of fear. That singular memory endures as her quiet, unyielding rebellion, her personal proof that dignity is never something granted or revoked by nations, but is instead carried intrinsically within the human spirit. And if an experience of captivity could reveal such a shattering truth, what enduring courage might freedom yet demand of her?